When I was thinking about tonight, it seems the one thing where I wanted to start with that we live two lives. We live in a historical life, and if we're not careful, our mind is wholly taken up by that life. A life of things to do, places to go, emails to send. Whatever seems to happen, you always get more emails, don't you? Whatever it is. So we live this historical, time-based life where we're born and we die. Very many people believe that's the only life we lead, but it strikes me that we have another life. I think we also have a mythic life, an archetypal life almost. Oops, come in. So we're living in time, obviously, all the time. Yet my increasing sense is that we're also living, as it were, highly inverted commas, outside time, or that our lives are trying to embody something outside of time. Slightly like Coleridge's idea about the idea. He said that you're always trying to live in time, an idea outside of time. So there's even an idea about a sort of ideal class tonight. There's us actually living this class, but all of us in our mind, somewhere, have got an idea about an ideal evening. And that sort of exists outside of time. And you're always trying to make your life in time close to this sort of idea out of time. Even something like, inviting friends round for a meal, you have an idea of what that is, which exists outside of time, as it were. And you're trying to live up to that in time. Yeah? So we have these two lives. We have a historical, prosaic life, and we have an archetypal life, a mythic life, poetic life. And spiritual practice makes you, Dharma practice, deepening your life as a human being, another way of putting it, makes you more sensitive, generally speaking, to your mythic life. The trouble is you can't know your mythic life. If you think you know it, usually it's just a fantasy. You can think, on some deeper level, that I'm trying to play this out in my life, but usually it's a fantasy when you think like that. You know your mythic life. I wish I hadn't started this, actually. Where's he go? I haven't been smoking anything. That's his peppermint tea. What is he talking about? Nonsense. You'd sort of, sometimes the smallest things, you feel at times, don't you, all of us feel at times, that it's as if our life is an unravelling of meaning. Sometimes even painfully so. It doesn't necessarily assume it's pleasant. It's as if there is a meaning that our life is wanting to unfold. Bhante says it's a bit like unrolling a Persian carpet. That you just see bits and bits of colour, and as you unroll the carpet, you see that it's got a whole pattern. And if you very genuinely, diligently, honestly practice a Dharma life, even for a short while, even more so if you've been doing it for a long time, you start to get hints and intimations of that being true, as if something is living through you, a pattern is trying to appear through you. Excuse me. As if you're here to do something. I remember, partly I was thinking about this because I remember being on holiday with Jan Vancha. We went to, I can't remember where we were now actually. We went to look at paintings, I think. And, we were in Barcelona. We went to a cafe and we were talking about a book that I think a friend of his had read about somebody who dictates from a friend of theirs who's dead. we've all been there. Their friend is dead, and they were able somehow, I can't quite remember the details, to dictate what it was like being dead. And this woman was saying that, can't remember the details now, but her basic sort of point was, oh yes, you keep getting reborn, and you have to learn certain lessons. The only thing that she seemed to be this, as they were dead, amencio, whatever the word is, the only thing she seemed to really frown upon was, one of the things she said was suicide, because she thought that you didn't learn lessons then. But the story is that you go, you live, and then you kind of die again, and you reflect. You not reflect on that, but you sort of learn the lessons, and then you've got other lessons to learn. I don't know what it was. We were just sitting outside a cafe in Barcelona. I think we were about to go and have an ice cream. But I thought, I think that might be true, or at least that might be not literally true, perhaps. But I thought, gosh, that chimes with something in my experience. But in such a quiet way, it's almost like, have I dreamed that that's true? You can't look at it head on. I mean, it's analogous to someone like Picasso thinking, what should I do? I think I'll invent cubism. Picasso would have been fumbling his way, and it's only when you look back on his life's work that it all makes incredible sense. He must have felt he made these incredible changes of direction, didn't know whether he was going the right way, But when you actually look at it, if you go to Paris and see the Picasso Museum, which has got a sort of retrospective of his work, good examples of his work through his life, you can sort of feel that something's unfolding, that there is a vision that's trying to be unfolded. All the way up to those sort of complex, difficult, almost angry late paintings. He was terrified of death, Picasso. So that his one of his wives, or mistresses, I can't remember which one, so was talking to him and realised that the parrot was dead. And she sort of quietly got him out of the room, jumped in the car, drove to town, got a new parrot, brought it back without him noticing. So if you look at his work, there's a sense that something is unfolding. And I think that is true of our human life, that something is unfolding. The difficulty is to know whether our sense of that is a fantasy or not. It's very easy to have fantasies. I've been thinking more and more about fantasy. I think, I was partly struck I was with Ria, one of my partner's daughters. We were watching The Voice. It's the only time I've watched The Voice. She's very keen. I'm struck again, there's so many programs like that. And really they've got all sorts of good things, of course, but partly they just peddle a fantasy that you too can be rich and famous. And you tend to have those fantasies in a world where less and less people are rich and famous. I was talking last week about the La La Land and the reappearance of the musical. Those things tend to happen, that those fantasist things happen when life is getting more and more difficult. So you have a fantasy that I could become rich and famous, and that inoculates you against the actual facts of your life and stops you doing anything about it. You end up in a fantasy. I think, unfortunately, spiritual life itself can become a fantasy. I might come on to that later on. It's quite easy, even for Buddhism, to become a sort of fantasy. It's probably quite difficult not to have elements of fantasy in it, and elements of fantasy in our life. So it's quite difficult to talk about this mythic level of our life without getting involved in fantasy. Probably it's more a question of faith, that your life intrinsically means something. Even the bad things in your life mean something. There is some kind of purpose working its way through your life. And I want to think of that life as a mythic life, not a prosaic life, not a historical life, but a kind of mythic life. Poets at their best touch onto it. I remember when I first started writing poetry, indeed it is poetry, when I started writing lines, you don't get to the end of the page. I remember thinking I didn't have a poetic childhood. I think I'd been reading a biography of Auden, W.H. Auden, the English poet. his mother used to play the piano version of Tristan and Isolde, and they'd sing along together. And I thought, that is a million miles away from my childhood. I thought I didn't have a poetic childhood. But what I've discovered as I've written stuff, the things that in my childhood which seemed not very interesting, not profound, not have any meaning, some of those things seem to stay and glow a bit. They seem to have a kind of meaning that I didn't realise they had at the time. And that seems very close to myth, seems very close to story, seems very close to dream. It's like time clarifies as well as obscures. And it's as if after the waves of time, some things still show out. And as if they're suggesting a pattern. You can't get to the pattern, but you can have this feeling of a pattern, that they mean something, that they cohere in some way. And as you practice, you can feel that more and more. Of course, you have to, as I say, be very careful, because it's very easy to mix up with fantasy, which is fantasy is nearly always self-serving. So if you think you were, Cleopatra's handmaiden in previous life, that's probably a self-serving fantasy. You were probably a slave. So you can't think about it head on, but you start to have intimations of it, hints of it, I think. I don't even completely know what it means, but I feel more and more sure that life has intrinsic meaning. And when you say intrinsic meaning, they're terribly abstract things to say, meaning. Where would you ever find that? And is it open at this time of night? Where would you find meaning? Meaning has to be experienced through an individual person in their particularities and an apparent trivialness of their life. Makes me remember there's a Basho, famous medieval Zen poet. He wrote just one line: "Don't think your life didn't mean anything," or "Don't think your life didn't matter." And I think very tempting to think your life didn't matter. It seems absurd, given how many billions of us are on the planet now, that our life can matter. Don't think your life didn't matter. I think it requires a kind of faith. So much in modern life is mitigating against it. It's saying that we're just historical creatures and there aren't any meanings. Even Max Porter, in the interview I did with him on Saturday, he was saying, life is completely meaningless. And I nearly said, you don't know that. You think that's your belief, but you don't know that. I also don't know that this exists either. So it's really important to keep getting down to the fact that none of us know. So I think as you practice, as you meditate, as you try to be kind to people, as you try to be courageous, as you try to contribute more and more of your time and energy to the greatest good, when you do that, your historical life, as it were, becomes more transparent to your mythic life. And it starts to become quite difficult to see where history and in what sense are they different, history and myth. And things like coincidence and all sorts of things can come into that. But sometimes it's not even as sort of spooky as that. It's just a sense, a quiet sense, almost in unfeelable sense, that I am doing something. Often you don't know, just like if you're a Picasso, you'd be, trying this, trying that, painting stuff out, ruining stuff, throwing it away, scraping paint off. But you'd have this sense that I'm trying to do something here, which is both intimate and particular, and trying to get at something universal. All these words are problematic, I know. So it seems to me that one of the things we're trying to do is a faith that our life matters. And not matters in a sense of rights, although, of course there's a place for that. That's too small. That our life is big, our life matters in some full sense, some fully meaningful sense, not just, I don't know, because we're good at something or do something or nice or vote properly and all that sort of thing or say the right things about politics, but because something matters. Yeah? So what you see, the more developed somebody is, generally speaking, the more you see their life in that way a bit. I see that very much in Bante's life, my teacher's life, our teacher's life. And you see it exemplified in the figure of the Buddha and the Buddha's life. So that history and myth in the Buddha's life is very, very difficult to untwine, and to try to pull them apart is to overvalue history, as if that's really what we're trying to get to. We can easily think that is the facts. I need to get to, but what happened? As if our life is ever graspable like that. Even a cup of tea with a friend, a walk in the park, in the evening at the desk. You never quite grasp its history, its literalness, if you see what I mean. But the Buddha's life exemplifies that. There is myth and history, and they are transparent to each other. So last week I talked about the Buddha, the Buddha to be, before he was the Buddha, in the palace, in the pleasure palace. I talked a lot about pleasure. I might come back to that. I don't know if I'll get that in, but I'd like to. It's very important. And that I said that he was brought up by a king. His mother died when he was a child. And I was struck by that. So many fairy stories start with orphans, don't they? I saw BFG a while ago. I thought it was wonderful. I've never read the books. I thought it was really wonderful. She's an orphan, isn't she? And it starts in an orphanage. And that, again, is symbolic of our situation. That we are orphans. It's not just a literal orphan. We are orphans in the sense that we don't actually feel like a mixture of our parents. Actually, they say now that 50% of our behaviour, our personality is genetic. It doesn't feel like that. You feel uniquely you. You feel like you just awoke, don't you, with you. I'm reading Paradise Lost, and there's a lovely moment where God breathes into Adam's nostrils and he just wakes up. And he just thinks, how did I get here? Here I am on a flowery bank. They're always waking up on flowery banks in those kind of poems. How did I get here? And I thought there's something really true about that. It's like we just wake up into me, like as if we're an orphan. Anyway, so the Buddha's life exemplifies this sort of history and myth going together. And in the story, his father's a king, and of course he would be. And he's living in a palace, and of course he would be. But this palace is a palace where nothing difficult, nothing painful can be allowed in. It's a pleasure dome. And the king tries to keep out anything that would cause pain to his beloved son. And in the story I was telling last week, he asks Chandaka, his charioteer, to take him out of the palace. He disobeys his father's orders, and he goes out of the palace. There's something in that, but I might come back to that. And he sees an ill person, then an old person, then a dead person. And each time I imagine him to be completely shocked by that seeing. And he goes back to the palace, ruminates on that, tries to forget it, but keeps going out. Yeah, and because it's a fairy story, effectively, because it's a story outside time, because it's a mythic story. In mythic stories, because they're outside time, I didn't realise this last week when I was talking, they happen immediately. So he sees these things as if for the first time. That's what the metaphor is, isn't it? As if for the first time. I would imagine, in terms of history, he'd seen all of those things. But he sees them as if for the first time in that timeless time of myth. Yeah. So he's had the three sights, and he's gone back to the palace. And you can imagine him, as so many of us do, trying to shut it out, trying to block it out, turn the music up, have more fun, have more sex, have more things, exercise more, get involved in the arts, do whatever you can to kind of block out those facts of life. And you can even imagine him talking to his friends about it, perhaps his father about it, perhaps his wife about it, Yashoda about it, saying, somehow stumblingly saying, I realise I'm going to die. You can imagine trying to say that. Actually, I know that I'm going to die. I know that I'm going to get sick. I know I'm going to get old. Actually, even the old is actually if you're lucky. And you can imagine his friends. You can imagine Yashoda saying, "Yeah, of course you are," but trying to answer that, trying to come up with solutions to that. They might say, "Oh yes, but you're going to be reincarnated," or they might say, "Well, you'll live on in your son." That was my family's idea of immortality: is that you live on in children, and so you never die in that sense. Which I've always thought a bit tricky because, yeah, but they're not me, and I didn't kind of feel like that. Anyway, but you can imagine people trying to come up with solutions to that. And of course, there isn't a solution to that. And Siddhartha seemed to be somebody of quite remarkable perspicacity and integrity, so that he could see that these half solutions weren't solutions. Living on in children, I don't know, being reincarnated, or somebody would say, perhaps, don't bother yourself with a problem you can't solve. They're all false solutions, and I think I was last week talking about the death of my grandmother. And I really had this experience. I was very young, I was about 6 or 7 or something. And I had this really strong experience that my parents didn't know what to do about this and didn't know what had happened. My father said she's sleeping. I think my mother said she's gone to a better place. And I thought, I have no idea what's going on here, but it's definitely not those two things. She's definitely not sleeping because I'd seen her sleeping. No way, And I seemed to know, even as a child, that they didn't know, that they didn't have a solution to this. And I thought that was a massive problem. There was my grandmother, who I loved my grandmother. I used to go running around every day and talk to her all the time. I used to talk a lot when I was a child. I don't know whether that's a surprise. I used to talk and talk. My grandmother was terribly indulgent. And I thought the fact that they didn't know, they didn't have a solution to this. Parents are supposed to have solutions. What's that sound? Oh, that's just this happening. What if I get ill? Oh, don't worry. You have solutions. But I seem to know they didn't have a solution. So we have to imagine Siddhartha as now tormented. And what that can do when you really confront death, old age, sickness, is that one's pleasures seem disgusting. That life itself seems disgusting. I think there's much more to be said for that. There's actually a state of mind called disgust, a positive state of mind. Of course, you have to be, again, very, very careful it doesn't get mixed up with, self-hatred, just hatred, dislike, something neurotic. But there is such a thing as kind of disgust with life, where you see through it, and it just all seems like pretense and ignorance and disgust. I have had my moments of feeling that very strongly, and I've never been able to explain it to people because it sounds bad, it sounds like, get a grip, enjoy yourself. But I think there is a genuine kind of disgust. The trivialness of life, the point-missing trivialness of life, of the game playing that I'm afraid we all do on one level or not. So he must have had this feeling of disgust. And you can see that if we'd not gone any further from there, what you then end up with is nihilism, you end up with despair, you end up with... And you see this in people, I think, highly intelligent, highly talented people railing against the bars of life, with no belief in more than that. Very, very sad to see it, but I think you can quite often see it, particularly in artistic and scientific, those sort of professorial kind of lives, particularly as people get older. But then he goes out again, and you can imagine him going out again, really feeling, I don't know, I've got to get out of here. Siddhartha perhaps doesn't know why he has to get out, he's just got to get out of here. That sense of wanting to get out. We've all had that, I'm sure. I've got to get out of here. I will die here. I'll be suffocated here. And then he goes out and, in the crowd, suddenly, just for a moment, I imagine it, between all the sellers and the people in the marketplace, he suddenly, just for a moment, just catches sight of a wandering holy man. And I imagine the crowd opening. You see this figure in yellow robes, although what that meant then was the poorest possible ripped up old bits of rag sewn together and dyed with saffron, I think. No, I can't remember what it was. Dyed with something that basically spoils them so that nobody would want them. It was only later in Buddhist tradition they become the designer outfit that they unfortunately have. I mean, originally it was just basically wearing rags. You'd be disgusted to meet them. You wouldn't think, oh, how lovely. You'd think, gosh, smelly and disgusting. And when he saw that wandering holy man, he had it's a glimpse of his potential. It's a glimpse of the solution. It's a glimpse of a real solution, not a mock solution, not a half solution. It's a glimpse of a real solution. And again, in the mythic story of the parable, glimpses it and then it closes. He doesn't get to talk to the person, he doesn't ask them about what are they doing. There's just a glimpse of a real solution. Possibly, coming out of the turmoil and disgust for worldly life, coming out of the knowledge of death. Sometimes in that darkest place, if you can dive into it, you get a glimpse of a solution. You can't say what the solution is because a solution can't be said in words. I tended to go off into cod philosophy, but I won't do that. So he had this glimpse of a solution, and he asked Chanda, so he asked his charioteer, okay, who is this person? Chanda said, it's a wandering holy man. He's gone in search of the truth. But all of us have had glimpses of things, glimpses of a solution. For me, it was when I first came to this room. One of my glimpses. I was 25. I was at art school. A friend of mine had suggested I come here. I cycled from my squat in Brixton, and it was very cold. And I remember getting here very vividly. And I remember coming through those doors. I mean, nothing much has changed. We repainted the walls recently, but I remember coming through those doors and seeing the Buddha figure, and I thought, oh, they've got one of those. How embarrassing. How then? I was a goldsmith where burning a tyre and having a dead crow would have been much more appropriate. The idea of having a golden statue, I thought, how embarrassing, how Victorian. And I had that feeling at exactly the same time. I had this sense of how wonderful, how completely wonderful, and yet that feeling seemed to be almost part of my mythic life, underneath my historical life, which was terribly Goldsmiths, darling. But I remember coming there, and I had that, and then someone taught me the mindfulness of breathing, an old member who's actually since resigned, and he just taught the mindfulness of breathing, and I thought, oh yes, that's what I am. I'm a Buddhist. I've always been a Buddhist, and I always will be a Buddhist. That's what life is for, yeah. And then I did the meditation. I just nodded off through that whole. It was nothing to do with experience. I just he taught me the mindfulness breathing. I thought, oh, that's what I am, yeah. Not just that's what I am, but actually that's what life is for. Actually, I also knew it would be hard. And then I knew that the problems wouldn't be in me, they wouldn't be in the Dharma, they'd be in me. And that's come true as well. Just as a kind of health warning. It's not so hard now. It was. But that was like a glimpse immediately. And I carried on coming here. And I remember a friend of mine stopping coming. And I just thought, you can't stop coming. You can't do that. I mean, you can talk about it and have issues with it, and you can have, but you can't stop coming. No, because this is what life is for. I literally felt shocked that you could just stop. But you can't just stop coming. I felt like ringing them up. What's your problem? And it wasn't because it wasn't particularly because I was really struck by that particular order member teaching. It wasn't. I even didn't really know the difference between Buddhism then and Vedanta, because on that very same night I asked somebody where the Swami was, and they said, we don't have a Swami. And I thought, oh, what a shame. I rather fancied a Swami as someone very mystical. Long beard, probably Oriental. Anyway, so that was one of my sort of glimpses. So it's all of us have had a glimpse of a real solution. Yeah. But mostly what we do is that we don't act on it. Those glimpses, unless they're acted on and activated, they die. It's a bit like you get a glimpse, often it's on retreat, and it's a bit like you get a glimpse, and it's a bit like one of those things where you have to activate it by clicking, they send you an email and you answer the email and it activates it. Unless you do something about it, the glimpse goes away. It's only because of the continuing history of Siddhartha that that's not the case. But lots of people have had those glimpses. And they can be actually very, very strong glimpses. I remember very early on talking to somebody at a Wednesday class, a newcomers class, and just telling me about an experience he'd had on a walking holiday. I thought, oh, that's definitely a glimpse of reality. Yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. They're fairly common. But they usually disappear. Usually life takes over. You even have a glimpse of death, or the realities of old age sickness and death, but usually that disappears. It can be really shaming. You can come away from being really quite touched by those realities and then be completely out of touch with them within days, in hours, Very odd. So, but Siddhartha sees this glimpse and he acts. So he leaves. So he goes back, according to the story, goes back to the palace, probably full of that kind of possibility, that sense of there is actually a solution out there somewhere. Full of that, not being able to talk to anyone about that because he couldn't put it into words. And he leaves in the middle of the night. So there's lots of different tellings of this story, but his father's asleep, his wife, and he's got a son by now. He's asleep, little boy. And he decides that he can't bear to wake them because he fears that if he woke them, he'd lose courage. He wouldn't be able to follow his instinct, his very, very deep instinct. So he, according to some stories, he goes and stands in the doorway and looks at his wife and sleeping son, but won't wake them, won't wake his father. He asks his charioteer to saddle his beautiful white horse called Kantaka. It's even got a name. So again, the horse would have a name in a legend, and it would have to be a white horse, that beautiful white horse, a stallion, snow white horse. And he gets on the horse, and he's followed by Kantaka walks behind. You usually see pictures of them. Chandaka walks behind. Chanda walks behind, and as if by magic, all the guards of the palace, because the father has posted guards around the palace to stop Siddhartha leaving, they fall asleep, and devas, which are really effectively sort of Buddhist angels, they're figures of light. They appear and they put their hands out so that the Kantaka's horse, his hooves, can ride on their hands, their angelic hands, so that the clip-clopping across the courtyard, those cobbles in the courtyard, so that doesn't wake anybody up. And then the gates open by magic, and you have these angels, effectively, that's what we'd call them, holding out their hands so there's no sound. So I find that, after all these years, still kind of ravishingly beautiful image. We need to take it symbolically, but we need not to take it too symbolically. So it doesn't necessarily, we're in the land of myth, in our mythic life. It doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that you leave your aging father and baby son. But it does mean that you need to change. And that means that needs to have an external dimension as well as an internal dimension. It's too easily said that the change is internal. Most internal changes can't survive because the world around us is so much with us. As Werther said, the world is so much with us. Getting and spending, we lay waste our lives. Unless you actually actively change your life, change the company you keep often, for instance, with the places you go, very, very, very difficult to have an internal change. So yes, let's read it symbolically, but let's not read it too symbolically. Anyway, so he leaves, and I want to think of this as the archetype of departure. It sounds like a painting title by surrealists, but called the archetype of departure. This is in the fairy story, the Buddha leaving the world. He's leaving the palace, and the palace comes to represent our habitual mindset. The Buddha's habitual mindset is extraordinarily positive and pleasure-filled. Yeah, that might not be our habitual mindset. It wasn't my habitual mindset when I first came to this centre. I was an agonised, rather neurotic young man. I could be the life and soul of the party at one moment and very, very unhappy and very critical the next. But all of that was my habitual mindset. So this is a metaphor for leaving behind your habitual mindset, your unexamined assumptions, unexamined prejudices, your lack of thought, genuine thought, your lack of genuine feeling. I say you, I mean me. You leave all that behind. You leave your habitual mindset behind. You go off into the jungle. And you have to remember this is an ancient jungle, so it's going on forever. And there's nobody forever. You go off into the jungle. Interesting, you go off with this white stallion, although you're going to have to leave that as well. So it's also a metaphor for leaving behind the social milieu, the bounded social milieu that you tend to be involved in. It's very, very easy, particularly in modern urban life, just to be involved in a kind of style tribe. I don't know whether you're into Gothic, or you're a banker, or you write poems, or you work in a science lab. Very, very easy just to spend time with people like you, the same race, broadly the same opinions. It would be quite good, for instance, if we had a good smattering of pro-Trump people in this room. If you're not careful, you just gather around and everybody sort of grumbles about him. And I don't think that's always very good for us. We all settle down in a set of views that we think are right. I'm not saying Trump is right, or I'm not even saying anything good about it. I'm just warning us about our mindset that we settle into. We all do it, and it's too comfortable. So it's leaving behind that mindset. It's also leaving behind the set of repetitive social behaviours that you've got stuck in. We all get stuck in them. Of course, in the mythic language of the fairy story, in the mythic language of myth, you leave it behind once and for all in one moment. The Buddha-to-be gets on a white stallion and rides off into the darkness. Once and for all, you leave it all behind. But what it needs to do in our lives is it needs to be lived out again and again. This stepping out of our ordinary mindset, this stepping out of our prejudices, our assumptions, our lack of thinking, and so on, our automaton kind of nature that we can so easily fall back into. Stepping out of it again and again and again. Stepping out of especially our selfishness again and again and again. Really that little place is that place of me, and this is the symbol of acting out of that, acting out away from that, getting out of that. It's stepping out of all that, stepping out of our selfishness. We have to do that again and again and again. We're not in a fairy story. We're living so much of our time in historic time. We have to keep on in that time, stepping out again and again and again. So what you get in Siddhartha's life is the archetype of departure. He just does it straight away. He leaves the world behind forever. We have to keep on doing that. Yeah. Then he goes off into the jungle in the night, in the middle. Of course, this happens in the middle of the night. And the reason it happens in the middle of the night, and the reason the guards are asleep, and his wife is asleep, and the king is asleep, is because when you leave the world behind, when you leave behind group behaviour, the world doesn't recognise what you're doing. The world can't understand what you're trying to do. Even sometimes when people say, you're going to a meditation class, people don't understand what you're trying to do. Then why would you go to East London and sit and close your eyes for it? People sometimes really don't understand what you're trying to do. I remember when I became a vegetarian, people didn't understand what I was trying to do. So if, to the degree you genuinely will leave the world behind, the world will not understand you. I think there's something that, to be really remembered in that, there's a loneliness in that sometimes. The world will not understand you. And it gets at times more difficult to be understood. And that's what that's the symbolism of people falling asleep, is they literally can't see what he's doing. They literally can't see what he's doing. And those guards that are guarding the gates of the palace, they're the guardians of the ordinary. They're the people who try and keep us getting and spending, getting bored, going on holidays, watching DVDs, not thinking, pretending that we don't die, pretending that life isn't what life is. They're the guardians of the ordinary. They're the guardians of history. They're guardians of the day-to-day. And they keep us small. So yeah, he leaves all of that behind in this mythic moment. He drives to the very edge of his father's territory, at the Inoma River. And when he gets to the very edge of his father's territory, which again is a symbol for even things that to do with your past, to do with history, to do with the tribe of your family, you're leaving all of that behind. It's then that he gives the horse back to Chandaka and tells Chandaka to ride the horse back to the palace. It's then that he cuts his beautiful long blue-black hair, shaves his beard. It's then that he exchanges his princely clothes with a passing beggar, which is really the beginning of the first Buddhist robe, really. It's just a beggar's clothes. You imagine walking back to the tube and, swapping your designer gear for the beggar just sitting outside the tube. That's what he did. And what I want to finish with, and then we'll do a mantra, is that what strikes me is the presence of the devas, the presence of angels. So they appear holding their hands underneath the hooves of the horse. And they appear when Siddhartha cuts his hair. You can sometimes see pictures of Siddhartha, with his hair in a great top knot. They'd have great long blue black hair and cutting it off with a sword usually. But you can just as much as expect him to be hacking it off with scissors. And the devas come and collect it. They come and collect the hair. Now, devas, supernatural events in a story like this, in a myth like this, they're very, very important because they tell you that something universal is happening. They tell you that this is really important. And what's interesting to me is that the devas don't appear when he sees an old man, sick men, or the dead man. They don't appear when he even sees the fourth side, the wandering holy man. There's no devas around the wandering holy man. And that's because I think, yep, that happens to all of us. All of those sides happen to all of us. They appear, crucially appear, when he decides to act. They crucially appear when he decides to act. He acts decisively for all time, but they crucially appear at that moment, because that's when you know that though you've been touched by those sides. Until you act, probably you haven't been touched by them very deeply. It's when you've been touched by something very deeply that it makes you think, it makes you change your life, it makes you change the patterning of your life, sometimes even against your own instinct. I remember a time when I decided to ask for ordination, donkeys years ago, and somebody asked me, "Oh, are you going to ask for ordination?" I said, "No way, no, I'm fine, I don't want to ask for ordination, that's not me at all." And as I was saying it, I had this horrible feeling, I'm going to ask for ordination. I was like trying to push it down, thinking, I'm definitely not, I'm not. So it was really against my instinct, it really was. But it's this moment where you decide to act. Sometimes, even though you think it's really not a good idea, what will people think, all of that stuff, you decide to act. And then the devas appear. And cutting his hair is a symbol of completely renouncing the world. And then the devas appear. Actually, we need to be cutting lock after lock. We probably never, any of us, up to that kind of incredible decisive action. And probably it's not even like that for Siddhartha quite. We're in the land of myth, which, as I said, is transparent to history, but not the same as history. And then he just walks off, completely alone. And it's only because some of us know the rest of the story that seems all right. It doesn't seem all right to him. He's a pampered boy. He's very, very young. He's a pampered boy. He's had a very, very privileged life. He's had everything he wants. He's had lots of pleasure. He's been impelled by the force of reality, which is old age, sickness and death, to be shaken to his core. He's had a glimpse that there is actually, completely amazingly, miraculously, some kind of solution. But he doesn't know what solution means. And he's literally gone off in search of it. But all that's happening now, if it was a film, you'd want to pan away up and up and up and see this in the moonlight, a man dressed in beggar's robes, young man dressed in beggar's robes, wandering into the trees. And as the camera goes up and up and up, you just see the incredible expanse of jungle with its tigers and monkeys and dangers and darknesses. And all you see as we finish this part of the story tonight is this terrible expanse of jungle and one man walking alone.